This is the kind of report that will likely trigger Joe Biden to take a victory lap. Even though we know that inflation is eating into people's savings, but you don't see that in this number.
Oh, from a political perspective, I would imagine we'll see the president in front of microphones this morning, obviously touting this number. But I'll share a stat with you here, Maria, and it really is incredible. The jobs count has now beaten estimates 14 of the last 17 months. So we thought we were going to get a number here. It ends up being here. In this case, in the month of May, we're talking about 140,000 more jobs added than was expected. It is amazing how the estimates, people keep getting the estimate wrong.
This is a good report, no doubt about it. 339,000 jobs, much better than expected. Bill, what I like about this report is the fact that the jobs created that we are looking at are high-paying jobs. You're talking about jobs in business and professional services, in healthcare. The government jobs, by the way, also up 56,000. So you've got jobs that are higher paying than leisure and hospitality, which has been where much of the bulk of the job creation has been, leisure and hospitality. That's not the case this month. So that's a good story here, as well as a good story that it's better than expected overall. What I don't like about this report is the fact that unemployment is rising. The unemployment rate is now up to 3.7%. We also have a participation rate of 62.6%. What does that tell you? People do not want to go back to work. You see lots of these small businesses unable to open, have to shorten their hours because they can't find the workers to come back to work. I'm not crazy about the wage number. Wages, average hourly earnings rose 4.3%. Okay number, but still lower than inflation. In other words, inflation is still cutting into people's ability, and they're cutting into savings because they can't afford the inflation. All of this strong report that we're talking about has helped markets this morning, as well as the passage of the debt bill, of course, which, of course, investors reacted to right out of the gate this morning. But we now have an expectation that the Federal Reserve will take a pause in its next meeting. You've got the next Fed meeting on June 13th and June 14th. 75% of market participants say the Fed will likely take a pause, not raise rates again, and resume the raising of rates in the July meeting. We'll see if that changes as a result of this report. I'll point out that we get a very important inflation report out the day before we hear from the Fed on June 13th. The Consumer Price Index is out.
This is Fox host and resident legal liability Maria Bartiromo trying to do something, anything, to spin yet another gangbusters jobs report as a bad thing for Joe Biden. Now, to be clear, before we get into the desperate deflections by Bartiromo, I should know that the U.S. economy added 339,000 jobs this past month, well beyond the 195,000 jobs that were expected. We've now had 29 consecutive months of jobs growth, which, of course, began the very first month that Biden became president. He's now presided over the creation of 13.1 million jobs in just over 2 years, more jobs than have ever been added during a presidential term, even in 4 years. A pretty stunning accomplishment unto itself. But let's zoom out a little bit, because while Biden deserves a ton of credit, he's by no means the only Democratic president to have presided over a strong economy. Of the 49 million jobs created since 1989, 96% have been created under Democratic presidents. 96%. That's 47 million jobs added by Democratic presidents and 1.9 million added by Republican presidents. Biden alone has created almost 7 times as many jobs as the last 3 Republican presidents combined. Not great for a political party that's branded itself the party of jobs, jobs, jobs. As for the unemployment rate, consider this. George H.W. Bush left office with a 7.3% unemployment rate. Clinton left office with a 4.2% unemployment rate. Then George W. Bush left office with a 7.8% unemployment rate. And Obama left office with a 4.7% unemployment rate. Noticing a trend? Trump left office with a 6.3% unemployment rate, and Biden brought it back down to 3.7%. So again, in my entire lifetime, Republicans have exclusively allowed the unemployment rate to rise under their watch. They've simultaneously allowed the deficit as a percent of GDP to surge. Every single Republican president of the last 3 decades has watched it increase, and every Democratic president of the last 3 decades has watched it decrease. In fact, during Trump's term, all of those fiscally responsible Republicans voted unanimously to add $7.8 trillion to the debt to give themselves a tax cut. A quarter of all of the U.S. debt was accrued under Donald Trump himself. So this idea that Republicans are fiscally responsible might be nice branding for them, but it is undermined by every single factual economic metric that exists. Now, as for Maria Bartiromo, first off, she would be well served to acknowledge even 10% of what I just said, although I realized that unless it was spread by some far-right conspiracy theorist ripe for a defamation lawsuit, she probably isn't listening. But in terms of her desperation to find something to complain about, she and her guests do ultimately land on inflation. But just to give some context here, we've just come out of a global supply chain crisis due to COVID and another global supply chain crisis due to Russia invading Ukraine. One of these alone would be enough to cripple our supply chains and send costs soaring. Both together is unprecedented. And in case you might have stumbled across Fox or Newsmax or OAN and thought this was some uniquely American problem caused solely by Joe Biden, maybe take a look at the other industrialized countries around the world. Whereas the US is dealing with 4.9% inflation, France has 5.9%, the Eurozone as a whole has 6.9%, Germany has 7.2%, the UK has 8.7%. So not only is the US not the only country contending with high inflation, we've actually performed better than the majority of industrialized countries. And by the way, knowing that the two major drivers of inflation have been COVID and Russia's Ukraine invasion, maybe ask yourself what Republicans have done to mitigate the impacts of those two events in particular. On COVID, they pretended it didn't exist, and Trump presided over 20% of the world's cases and deaths for only 5% of the world's population, while the rest of his party dutifully echoed those claims. Maybe not a great strategy for one of the most deadly mass-killing events in American history. And as far as Russia's invasion of Ukraine is concerned, Republicans have barely been able to denounce Putin. The guy had almost unilaterally destroyed massive elements of the global supply chain, and Trump and half of his party are auditioning to be his bunkmates in summer camp. So the idea that Republicans would complain about high inflation while exacerbating the actual catalysts for high inflation is just par for the course in today's GOP. Wail about a problem, all the while doing everything in your power to make that problem worse. Why? Because they don't want to fix any problems, but they sure as hell want to campaign on them. But in terms of the actual numbers when it comes to inflation, consider this. In the last 2 months for which we have complete data, February and March, the inflation rate increased 0.3% in February, that's an annualized rate of 3.6%, and then 0.1% in March, that's an annualized rate of 1.2%. The inflation rate in 2022 was 5.6%, meaning we're on track to see that number get more than cut in half. Meanwhile, according to Robert Shapiro, who served in both the Clinton and Obama administrations, quote, "The real disposable incomes of Americans on a per capita basis also rose sharply over the last 9 months, increasing at annual rates of 1.8% in the first quarter of this year, on top of gains of 1.1% in the fourth quarter of last year and 0.6% in the third quarter. That comes to increases in real disposable incomes of 3.6% per person on an annual basis over the last 9 months. That's something for Democrats to crow about, given that yearly inflation-adjusted income gains under Trump averaged 2.5% per person in 2017, 2018, and 2019. In other words, even before Trump was contending with COVID, Americans still didn't have as high disposable income growth as they have now. So look, I get that Republicans wanted this jobs report to be bad. I get that they want nothing more than to have some evidence to point to in order to perpetuate this misnomer that Republicans are responsible stewards of the economy. But the reality, based on the actual numbers, is that that couldn't be further from the truth. The only thing that is virtually guaranteed from Republicans, going back more than 3 decades, is that there will be fewer jobs added, if any, sky-high deficits, and an economic recession. And that'll be followed by a Democratic president cleaning up their messes, just like what happened after Bush 1, Bush 2, and Trump. So while I understand that they're desperate to see high inflation and low wages and big job losses, the fact is that they're going to have to wait until a Republican takes office before any of those things will happen. Before you go, I need some help. Please subscribe to the channel and do your part to help grow the progressive media ecosystem. I don't do sponsorships or paid ads, I won't ask for money, but just subscribing to this channel goes a really long way, and it helps get the message out to more people. The subscribe button is right here on the screen. You can also subscribe to my Spanish language channel, which I made to reach those crucial Spanish-speaking voters. That link is on the screen too. And finally, if you want to listen to my audio podcast, you can follow that link as well. Thanks so much for watching.